"Who do you think you are?" Melissa shouted. "You think you can control all of us forever? You're just an old, weak man clinging to lost power. Don't think for a second you can dominate this family anymore. We've got our own plan now." Every word she spoke was like a dagger slicing through the air, shattering what was left of their fragile bond. Her fury radiated, filling the room with heat. She took a step toward her father, eyes wide with anger, but he remained calm. Unshaken, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Your words don't hold weight here, Melissa," he replied, his voice smooth and composed. "You may think you're clever, but in the end you'll regret this. Take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." Melissa's eyes flickered with disbelief. How dare he stay so composed, so calm, while she was losing control of everything? She spun around, locking eyes with Daniel, her last hope. She needed him to stand by her side to speak out, but Daniel, standing there like a shadow of his former self, said nothing. He looked lost, as though he didn't know where he belonged anymore. Her eyes burned with frustration. "Daniel, what about you? Are you just going to stand there?" But Daniel said nothing. He looked at the floor, his silence screaming louder than any words. The silence in the room grew thick, suffocating. Melissa's face twisted, anger boiling inside her. She was used to being in control, to having her way, but now her power was slipping through her fingers and she wasn't sure if she could get it back. "Say something, Daniel," she hissed. "Do you want to see us ruined? You're just going to let him do this to us." Daniel's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while he didn't look away. "I don't know what to think anymore, Melissa," he whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. "I'm tired." Words hit like a slap to the face. She was expecting defiance, but instead there was defeat, resignation. Melissa's anger flared again, and without thinking she slapped him across the face. The sound echoed in the room, sharp and brutal. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes, the weight of years of lies and broken trust weighing down on him. The father, still sitting in his chair, didn't move. His eyes never left his daughter. He knew this was not the moment to react. It was the moment of truth, the moment everything had been leading up to. And in that silence he found his strength. Melissa spun on her heel, muttering under her breath as she stormed off toward the bedroom. Daniel stayed where he was, staring at the floor, unable to find the strength to stand up for himself. The house fell quiet, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound that filled the empty space. Time, something they had all taken for granted, was now the only thing left in their grasp. The father sat there, unmoved by the chaos around him. Knowing that the first step of his plan had already been set into motion, he didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight back. The silence was his weapon now, and it would speak louder than anything else. Patience, he thought to himself, his hand resting on the pocket watch in his pocket. Time will do the work for me. The house stood tall, like a witness to years of betrayal and secrets. It had been built with blood, sweat, and determination. Every brick a memory of struggles fought and sacrifices made. Yet now it seemed like a prison, a place where ghosts of the past lingered, waiting to be uncovered. The protagonist, an older man once proud and firm in his beliefs, now stood at the threshold of his home, knowing that the next chapter of his life would unfold in ways he never could have anticipated. His face was weathered like the house itself. The lines on his face spoke of a lifetime of effort, of a legacy built from the ground up, but what he had given, what he had sacrificed, had been thrown aside by those he loved most. He wasn't the man he used to be. Time had eroded him, worn him down, and yet he remained unwavering. He was a man who had seen both triumph and defeat, and now he stood as a shadow of what he once was, only this time his silence was more than a retreat. It was a strategy. He would wait, he would bide his time. His wife, his partner. His equal was gone, and with her the steadying hand he had relied on for so many years. Her absence was a hole, a vacuum that sucked the warmth out of the house, leaving only cold, empty spaces behind. It had been years since her death, but the pain of it still lingered. She had always been his anchor, and now he was adrift, but he wasn't alone. His son and daughter still lived under the same roof, bound by blood, but separated by lies, mistrust, and unresolved anger. Daniel, his son, had once been full of potential, bright, ambitious, full of life. But now he was a man broken by his choices, by the pressure of being caught between loyalty to his family and the overwhelming weight of his own moral compass. His eyes once gleamed with hope, but now they were clouded with doubt and regret. And then there was Melissa, his daughter. She had always been the fiery one, the one who spoke her mind, who demanded attention, who needed to be in control. But over the years, that fire had been consumed by something darker: greed. ambition. Desperation. She was no longer the girl who had once looked up to her father. Now, she was a woman who viewed him as an obstacle, someone in her way, someone who no longer mattered. But Melissa was blind to the reality that her father was not the man she thought he was. She saw weakness where there was none. The house had become a battleground, and everyone had chosen sides. Daniel, caught between the woman he had married and the father he had once admired, was now a man in crisis. Melissa had grown impatient, cruel even, believing that her father's failure to act on her demands was a sign of his weakness. But what she didn't realize was that he had been waiting for the right moment to make his move. This was the backdrop of their world, tension and resentment simmering just beneath the surface, like a pot on the edge of boiling over. In the quiet of his study, he gazed out of the window, lost in thought. The house was more than just a structure, it was his legacy. He had built it with his own 2 hands, brick by brick. It was a reflection of who he had been and who he had hoped to be. Now it was a symbol of everything he had worked for, yet was slowly slipping from his grasp. It wasn't just about the house. It was about respect. It was about honor. And it was about love, the love he had given to his children, the love that had shaped him into the man he had become. Yet now, in their eyes, he was no longer the pillar of strength. He had become the person they wanted to tear down. Daniel, his son, had once been his pride and joy. He had dreamed of handing down the house to him, of watching him carry on the legacy. But now he saw his son as someone broken, someone who had lost his way. Daniel had been weak in the face of Melissa's demands, and the father knew it. The silence between them was deafening. What had happened to the boy who had once admired him, the boy who had trusted him, and Melissa, his daughter? He had watched her grow from a child full of hope and potential to a woman driven by ambition, by a need to control. She had been spoiled, given everything she ever wanted, but now she wanted more. She wanted power, and power, as he had learned over the years, came with a price. But did she understand that? Did she understand the cost of betraying the family that had made her who she was? He didn't think so. The relationship between father and son had changed. It wasn't just the distance of years or the weight of age that had strained their bond. It was the way their lives had unfolded. Daniel, once so full of hope, had been twisted by the same forces that had corrupted Melissa. He had let her drag him into the darkness, away from the values he had once held dear. He had let her speak for him, think for him, and in doing so, he had lost himself. But the father still saw something in Daniel. He wasn't beyond saving yet. But Daniel had to come to that realization on his own. He couldn't force it on him. Daniel had to want to change. Melissa, on the other hand, was a force to be reckoned with. She was sharp, cunning, and unrelenting. She had inherited her father's will, but not his sense of honor. She had been raised to believe she deserved everything, and in her mind the house was just another thing to be conquered, another thing to control. The tension between them had been building for years, and now the father knew it was time to stop sitting idly by. It was time to take back what was his, to make a stand. He couldn't do it in the way they expected him to. He wasn't going to shout, he wasn't going to argue. He would let time be his ally. Patience had always been his greatest strength, and now it was time for him to let it work for him. The morning started like any other. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the once pristine kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, grounding the father in the same routine he had clung to for years. There was an eerie sense of calm, too calm, but the quiet wasn't a comfort, it was the calm before the storm. The tension that had been quietly simmering between the father, Daniel, and Melissa was about to come to a head. The father could feel it in his bones. He had been waiting for this moment, for a single event to tip the balance of power in the house. He had already prepared himself, and yet, even he didn't know what form that final catalyst would take. Then it happened. Melissa had been toying with the idea for weeks, if not longer. She had never liked her father's refusal to relinquish control, but her patience had worn thin. She had tried everything: manipulation, emotional blackmail, and even threats. Yet every time she thought she had him cornered, he would retreat into his silence, leaving her to wonder what he was planning. On this particular morning, however, Melissa had decided she had enough. She was done waiting. She was done playing the waiting game. She would take matters into her own hands, and she wouldn't stop until she had what she wanted. Melissa stormed into the study, her face flushed with frustration. The father sat at his desk, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes focused on the pocket watch ticking slowly beside him. It was as though he had been expecting this. Do you really think you can control everything in this house forever? Melissa's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. You've held onto this place like it's your last breath, but it's not. It's ours now. It's time for you to sign over the deed and let us take over. She leaned across the desk, her eyes locking with his. She had crossed the line. This wasn't a request anymore. It was an ultimatum. The father said nothing at first. His silence seemed to infuriate her even more, but he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he simply stared at her, his calmness in stark contrast to her fury. Before Melissa could escalate, the phone rang. It was a call that would change everything. The father reached for the receiver, his hand steady. He knew who it was before he even answered. It was Greg, the lawyer. Greg, the father said, his voice quiet but firm. On the other end, Greg's voice was calm but laced with something important, something that would set the stage for everything that would follow. We've got an issue. Greg said, there's a clause in the trust deed that neither you nor Melissa has fully grasped. It's about the house, the legacy you built. I think it's time we talk about it. If you're ready, I can come over today. The father's heart skipped a beat. He had known this day would come. He had arranged for these protections to be put in place long ago in case things ever took a turn like this. But he had never expected Melissa to push so hard, so fast. He had hoped that time, patience, would have allowed things to work out differently. But now everything was speeding up. The time had come for the truth to be revealed. I'll be waiting, the father said, his tone now colder, more resolute. Bring the papers. The moment the phone call ended, the father turned to Melissa, his face no longer the calm mask it once was. This time there was a fire in his eyes. He had waited too long, stayed silent for too long. It was time to end this once and for all. I will not sign the deed, he said slowly, his words firm. Wavering, I've built this house, this family, with everything I had. You cannot have it, not this way. You want control, you'll have to take it from me. But know this, there's more to this house than you realize. Melissa's face twisted with rage. She slammed her hands on the desk, her eyes wild. How dare you? You're nothing but an old man clinging to power, to something that should have been ours from the start. You've always controlled everything, this house, the land, even us. Her voice rose, shaking with fury, and now you think you can just keep it all from us. We deserve it. We have the right to everything you've built. The father rose slowly from his chair, the weight of his years heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve was stronger than ever. You want what's mine, you'll have to prove you deserve it. You've been given everything, too much maybe, but I see now that you've lost your way. You've turned my legacy into a battle, and I won't let you destroy it. The words hit Melissa like a slap. She recoiled, the fury in her eyes replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. For a moment she was quiet, her breath came in shallow gasps. Was this the moment she had been dreading, the moment when her father, whom she had underestimated, finally stood up for himself? But then the anger came back, sharper, more bitter. Enough of this, she shouted. I won't be dismissed like this. I'll make sure you regret this decision, you'll see. I'll take everything from you just like you did to us. The father sat in the study, his thoughts swirling. He could hear the ticking of the pocket watch on his desk, but it sounded distant now, almost muffled. Time had always been his ally, but now he wasn't sure how much time he had left before everything collapsed. When Greg arrived with the papers, the father's heart pounded. It was time. The moment had arrived. Greg placed the folder on the desk. Here's the final draft, he said quietly, his voice low. I've already notified the banks and the creditors. They know that you're the one in charge here, that the house and its legacy are yours and yours alone. Melissa's face went pale. The realization hit her like a freight train. She had underestimated him. She had thought she could pressure him into signing over everything, but now she saw that he had outmaneuvered her. Read it, Greg said, his eyes flicking to the father. Everything's set up. The house is secured. No one can touch it, not now, not ever. Melissa tried to grab the papers, her fingers trembling. This isn't over, she hissed. I'll find a way. I'll make you pay for this. The father simply watched as she stormed out of the room, her fury building with each step. He was done with her games, done with the lies. Later that night, the house was heavy with tension. The father sat alone in his study, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of the pocket watch. The weight of what had just transpired settled on him. He had drawn the line, and there was no turning back now. Melissa had made her move, and now he had made his. He wasn't sure how long it would take for the repercussions to be fully felt, but one thing was certain, everything had changed. The power dynamic had shifted, and Melissa and Daniel would have to face the consequences of their actions. The father's silence had finally been broken. The trigger had been pulled in the war for the house. The legacy and the family had officially begun. The house, once full of life and love, now felt like a tomb. The silence that had settled over the family was no longer peaceful, it was suffocating. The father had expected this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the hollow feeling of watching his family crumble around him. Every room in the house seemed to whisper of betrayal. Daniel was distant, retreating into himself, avoiding any confrontation with Melissa or the father. His guilt weighed heavily on him. But so did his growing frustration. He had been caught in the middle, torn between the loyalty to his mother and the realization that his father had been right all along. His silence was his way of coping, but it also served to distance him further from both the man who raised him and the woman who had always been his ally. Melissa, on the other hand, was a force of pure destruction. Her anger had become all-consuming, and the mask of control she once wore had shattered completely. She had tried everything to manipulate her father, but now she was faced with the undeniable truth. Her actions had backfired in the house. The one thing she had fought for was slipping out of her grasp. It all began with a single, fateful argument. Melissa had come home late one evening, her eyes red from crying, her face drawn with exhaustion. She entered the house with a determination that seemed more like desperation, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. She stormed into the living room where the father sat in his chair, the pocket watch resting on the table beside him, its ticking a constant reminder of the time that had been lost and wasted. "Why are you doing this to us?" Melissa's voice cracked, betraying the raw emotion she had tried to hide. "You're tearing this family apart, you're destroying everything we've worked for." Her fists clenched at her sides, her body trembling with rage. "We're your family, we're supposed to be together." The father didn't flinch, he didn't need to, he had seen this coming. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of truth. "You are my family, and that's exactly why I had to do this. I couldn't let you destroy everything that matters." Melissa's face twisted with fury, her tears now mingling with the anger that consumed her. "You're nothing but a selfish old man," she screamed. "This house was supposed to be ours. We were supposed to have everything, comfort, security, and you." "I gave you everything I could," the father interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you this house, this life, but you took it for granted. You never respected what it meant to have a family, what it meant to work for something, to sacrifice. You thought you could take everything without understanding the cost, and now look at you." The words cut deeper than anything else could. Melissa staggered back as if struck by an invisible force. The anger that had burned so brightly in her eyes now gave way to something darker, something much more frightening, a cold, empty realization that her father was right. As Melissa collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably, Daniel stood at the doorway, watching the exchange with a mixture of guilt and helplessness. He had seen this moment coming, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The family he had once known, the safety and security he had grown up with, was slipping through his fingers. He had tried to protect his mother. He had tried to shield her from the truth. But now, in this moment of raw vulnerability, he realized that he couldn't protect her from everything, not from herself, not from the consequences of her own actions. And he couldn't protect himself from the shame that gnawed at him, the knowledge that he had been complicit in the manipulation and lies. "I'm sorry, Dad," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know it would go this far." The father looked up at his son, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no disappointment, only a quiet sorrow, the kind that comes from witnessing the destruction of something once beautiful. "You did what you thought was right, Daniel," the father said softly, "but it's too late now. All we have left is the truth." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, his chest heaving with the weight of his regret. He had been silent for too long, and now the silence was his greatest torment. Melissa, now fully undone by her father's words, was no longer the woman she had been. The confident, calculating matriarch was gone. In her place was a broken woman, shattered by the realization that her entire life had been built on lies. She had fought so hard for control, for power, for the house. But in the end, it wasn't the house that mattered, it was the family. And now she had lost it all. Her rage turned inward, spiraling into a madness that consumed her every thought. She began to lash out not just at her father, but at Daniel as well. Her outbursts became more frequent, more violent. Every word she spoke was a weapon, every action a cry for attention. But deep down, she knew that she had already lost. The battle was over and she had lost. In her mind, there was no coming back. There was no redemption. She had lost her family, lost her home, and now she was losing herself. Throughout all of this, the father remained quiet. He had long ago accepted that the family he had known was gone. The betrayal, the manipulation, the lies, they had all been a part of the process. He had known it would come to this. But even as he stood firm in his resolve, even as he saw the destruction unfolding before him, there was a deep, almost mournful part of him that regretted the choices he had made. He had built this family, nurtured it, loved it, but now he realized there was nothing left to save. The house. The land, the legacy, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered now was the choice to let go, to allow the storm to run its course. The father, too, was broken, but he would never show it, not to Melissa, not to Daniel. The father's breakdown was silent, internal, and ultimately a release. One night, after days of silence and broken promises, Melissa confronted the father once again. She stood in the middle of the living room, her body trembling, her face pale. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You've changed. You're not the man I used to know." The father met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you were never meant to know me," he replied quietly. "I've been waiting for this moment, for you to see the truth, the real truth, and now you have. It's too late to fix anything, Melissa." In this pivotal section, the emotional journey of the characters reaches its deepest and most transformative point. The inner shift marks a critical turning point where the characters begin to recognize the truth about themselves, their actions, and their relationships. It's a moment of self-realization, growth, and understanding, where the shattered pieces of their past begin to fall into place, making way for a new sense of self. This part of the story reveals the resilience that lies beneath the surface of the father's stoic demeanor, the guilt and internal conflict that Daniel faces, and Melissa's gradual awakening as she realizes the full consequences of her manipulation. It is a time for introspection, where the characters are forced to confront themselves and begin their healing or transformation. Below is the development of this section, with a focus on deep psychological and emotional shifts. The father, having witnessed the complete breakdown of his family, had retreated into himself. His silence was no longer a tool of control but a shield, protecting him from the devastation around him. But beneath his quiet exterior, something had shifted. He had realized slowly that there was no going back. His choices had been made, and now in the wreckage of his family he could see the only thing that mattered: survival, not just his, but the survival of his dignity, his sense of self. For years he had given everything for his family, sacrificing his own happiness, his own peace of mind for the sake of others. But in the end, it was not gratitude he received. Instead, he had been taken for granted, manipulated, and betrayed. The trust he had once had in his children and in Melissa had evaporated. The house, once a symbol of his love and hard work, had become a battleground for greed and power. Yet now, in the stillness of the aftermath, the father understood that he had been stronger than he had ever given himself credit for. The slow ticking of the pocket watch in his pocket had been more than just a reminder of time passing. It had been a reminder that, no matter how much the world tried to break him, he would endure. He had survived the years of manipulation, the quiet whispers of betrayal. He had held firm, and though his family had fallen apart, he was still standing. This realization did not come in a sudden burst of emotion, but rather as a slow, steady understanding. The father was no longer just an old man clinging to something he had lost. He was someone who had endured, someone who had learned to adapt, to survive. Daniel, having been silent for so long, now faced a crucial turning point. His guilt weighed on him like a burden too heavy to bear. He had remained silent through the most critical moments, when his father needed him, when his mother needed him, and now that silence was the one thing he could no longer ignore. It was in his quiet moments alone that the full weight of his actions hit him. He saw himself complicit in his mother's schemes, passive in his father's suffering, and detached from the truth. He had been running away from his own conscience, too afraid to face the reality of what had happened. But now he couldn't escape it. The truth was undeniable. His hesitation, his fear of confronting the truth, had allowed the situation to spiral out of control. The house, the power, the manipulation, he had stood by, letting it all unfold, too afraid to choose a side. Yet in the quiet of his solitude, Daniel began to see the patterns of his own behavior. He realized that he had been living in the shadows, afraid of the consequences of standing up, afraid of the confrontation that would expose the truth. He had hoped things would fix themselves, that his silence would somehow keep the peace, but it hadn't, it never did. Now, for the first time, Daniel faced his own weaknesses. He had to confront the guilt that weighed heavily on his soul, the guilt that had been gnawing at him since the day he realized his father was right. He had allowed his mother to dictate his life, to control him with guilt and fear, and now he saw the truth. He had been afraid of losing his place, of losing the comfort he had grown used to, but in doing so he had lost himself. Daniel knew now that if he wanted to move forward, he had to face the truth. He had to step out of the shadows and take responsibility for his part in the family's collapse. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he acted from here on out. He couldn't undo the silence that had cost him his integrity, but he could find a way to make amends. Melissa's journey was the most tumultuous of all. Her anger had been the driving force behind her actions, the power she wielded over her family. But now, in the silence that followed the collapse, Melissa faced the one thing she had spent her life avoiding, the truth. For so long, she had justified her actions. She had believed that the house, the power, the control, it was all hers to claim. She had been raised to believe that she was entitled to everything she wanted, that it was her right to manipulate and twist the truth to suit her needs. She had convinced herself that she was protecting her family, securing their future. But now, faced with the reality of her choices, she saw everything for what it was, a lie. In the stillness of the house, as she sat alone in her room, Melissa began to feel the weight of her actions. The house, which she had fought so hard to keep, no longer felt like a victory. It felt empty, desolate. The things she had used to manipulate her family, the lies she had told, they all came rushing back, suffocating her. The guilt was overwhelming. For the first time, Melissa didn't know who she was anymore. The woman who had built her empire of control and manipulation, the woman who had fought tooth and nail for power, she no longer existed. What was left was a broken woman, staring into the abyss of her own actions. But this moment of clarity was not an instant fix. It was the beginning of something much deeper. Melissa had to face herself. She had to confront the truth about her life, her choices, and her relationships. It was a painful process, but one that would ultimately lead her toward a new understanding of herself. The road ahead would be long, but the first step had been taken. As the days passed, the father began to see the signs of change in his children. The silence that had once seemed like a fortress was now giving way to introspection. Melissa, though still angry, was no longer the same. There were cracks in her armor. Daniel, too, had begun to speak, though his words were filled with regret and uncertainty. They were a sign that he was ready to confront his past. The father didn't speak much during this time. Instead, he observed. He knew that this period of transformation wasn't something that could be forced. It had to come from within. The lessons of patience and resilience that he had learned over the years were now being passed down, not through words, but through example. In his silence, the father became a beacon of strength. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. His legacy was already written in the way he had lived, in the choices he had made, and in the family he had raised. He understood now that true power didn't lie in control. It lay in the ability to endure, to outlast the storms, and to keep standing when everything else fell apart. The father, Daniel, and Melissa were all on the edge of a profound shift. The family had fallen apart, but in that destruction there was the potential for something new. It wasn't about rebuilding what had been lost. It was about letting go of the past and embracing the future with open eyes and open hearts. For Daniel, it was about reclaiming his voice. For Melissa, it was about rediscovering her humanity and learning to live without control. For the father, it was about accepting that he had done what he could, and now it was time to let go. This was the inner shift, the moment where the characters, broken as they were, began to see the possibility of redemption, the hope for change. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was real. And as they faced the future, they realized that while the past couldn't be undone, they still had the power to shape the days ahead. It was in this painful truth that they found their strength within themselves and perhaps within each other. The family had been living in the wreckage of their choices for weeks now, and the days had begun to feel heavier. Daniel had withdrawn into a quiet, reflective state. Melissa remained a simmering cauldron of frustration and unspoken anger, while the father, though still largely silent, had become a figure of calm. Despite their fractured dynamics, it was clear to all of them that the past had fractured beyond repair. Now, all that remained was the inevitable reckoning. The father's resolve was unshakable, his strength tested by time and the ruthless disintegration of his family's bonds. Where Melissa's rage flared, where Daniel's guilt weighed down upon him, he was steady, a quiet pillar standing against the storm. He had no illusions about the past or his children's expectations of him. He no longer clung to the hope of restoration. He had learned, through years of sacrifices and disillusionments, that true strength was not in waiting for others to come to their senses. It was in taking action, in seizing control of his own destiny. His revenge, or perhaps a more fitting word, his justice, would not be served through violence or overt hostility. Instead, it would be served through the very tools he had painstakingly set in place long ago. He had prepared for this moment in the most subtle and profound way, through the law, through careful planning, and through a legacy of strength and wisdom that his children had failed to understand until now. For years, the house had been the epicenter of their turmoil. Once a symbol of comfort, stability, and family, it was now a prison, the walls echoing with betrayal, deceit, and broken trust. But for the father, the house was never truly about power. It had been about love, about providing a sanctuary. And now that it had become a battlefield, he knew what needed to be done. He would take back the control that had been so wrongfully usurped from him, but in a way that would strike at the core of their sense of entitlement. The decision was made. With careful precision, the father contacted his lawyer, Greg, the one ally who had stood by him all these years. The legal documents were finalized, every clause designed to protect him, his assets, and the legacy of his life's work. He had anticipated every move his children would make. And now the time had come to put everything into action. The documents were simple but devastating. The house, the land, and the wealth he had accumulated would be transferred to a trust, irrevocable, unchangeable, and out of the reach of his children. They would have nothing left but their pride and their broken relationship. The inheritance he had once hoped to pass down was now redirected to a charitable foundation, one that helped the families of veterans, an organization that represented sacrifice, loyalty, and honor, qualities that had long been forgotten in his own home. The father didn't need to say anything more. His actions would speak louder than any words ever could. He had set the stage for a quiet, devastating payback, one that would not be delivered in anger, but in the cold, unforgiving truth. Daniel had been living in the aftermath of his own conscience for too long, and now he found himself at the crossroads of redemption or despair. His guilt and regret were overwhelming, but there was still a spark of hope, a belief that somehow he could make things right. His mind wrestled with the truth of what had happened and the reality of the decisions he had allowed Melissa to make. One afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in the study, the house feeling unusually silent. His eyes fell on the pocket watch his father had kept for so many years, and for the first time he understood its significance. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a symbol of resilience, of waiting and enduring, of holding steady through the chaos. He had never fully appreciated it until now. It was time to act. Daniel knew the truth now, and he couldn't live with himself any longer. He could no longer be the passive participant in this family's destruction. As painful as it was, he had to confront his father, and he had to stand up to Melissa. Walking into the living room, he found his father sitting calmly in the chair as he always did. But now something had changed. His father wasn't the frail, helpless old man Melissa had painted him to be. He was the patriarch, silent, strong, and firm in his decisions. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice shaky, "I know what's coming. I can't undo what I've done. I should have stood by you. I should have." He trailed off, unable to find the words. The father's gaze met his. "It's too late for apologies, Daniel," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've made your choices, but there's still time to make them right. Do what you need to do." The words struck Daniel with the force of a thunderclap. His father wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even angry anymore. He had moved past that. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about understanding that the future was still in their hands. Daniel nodded slowly, a new resolve beginning to build inside him. This was his moment, his turning point. He didn't need to carry the weight of his past anymore. He had to step up and make a choice for himself, one that would redeem him in his own eyes. While Daniel began to find clarity, Melissa's world was crumbling. The once powerful matriarch, the woman who had dominated every conversation and every decision, now found herself at the mercy of her own manipulations. She had always relied on force, on words sharp as daggers, on the subtle emotional warfare that had kept everyone in line. But now those same tactics were turning against her. Her attempts to regain control of the family were futile. The walls she had built with lies and manipulation had cracked, and now there was no going back. She had no more cards to play. The house, the money, the power, everything she had fought for was slipping away. When the legal documents arrived, the irrevocable trust, the designation of the charitable foundation, Melissa's face turned ashen. She had underestimated her father, never realizing that beneath the surface of his silence lay a depth of planning that could not be undone. "Do you really think you can just take everything from me?" Melissa spat, her voice laced with venom. "You think you can destroy us and walk away unscathed?" The father, calm as always, looked at her with an unreadable expression. "No, Melissa," he replied quietly. "I didn't destroy anything, you did that yourself." The final blow wasn't delivered with shouting, with a final confrontation or a moment of rage. Instead, it came quietly, with the certainty of a well-laid plan. The father had taken back control, not through force, but through wisdom and patience, and in doing so he had reclaimed his dignity, his legacy, and his peace. As the days passed, the fallout from the legal decisions began to ripple through the family. Melissa's power was gone, and with it, the foundation she had so carefully built. She was left alone, no longer able to manipulate the people around her, no longer able to claim the house as her own. Daniel, though still grappling with his guilt, had begun to make his own decisions. He reached out to the charitable foundation, working alongside them to make amends for the choices he had made. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. And the father, he sat in his chair, his pocket watch ticking steadily in his hand, watching the family he had once known unravel. But now he knew the time had come for him to move forward. The justice he had sought had been delivered, not in anger, but in quiet determination. The house had never felt more silent. The storms that had raged within its walls, storms of fury, betrayal, and desperation, had finally subsided, and yet in the stillness there was a strange peace. It wasn't the kind of peace one might expect after a great battle. It wasn't the peace of a conclusion, of closure, but the kind of peace that comes after a profound understanding. The kind of peace that settles deep within, quiet and unshakable. The father stood by the window, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders, but there was no longer any anger. No more bitterness, no more regret. His gaze swept across the yard, the very same yard that had witnessed so much chaos, so many arguments, so many broken promises. Now everything lay still, untouched by time, but marked by it, by the silent passage of all that had happened. The pocket watch rested in his hand, the ticking steady and constant, like the heartbeat of the house itself. Time, he realized, had been his greatest ally. It had given him the space to plan, to act, and ultimately to rebuild, not the way others expected, but in a way that was uniquely his own. It wasn't the first time he had looked at his legacy. He had long known that the house, the land, the wealth, none of it truly belonged to him. He had always known it was fleeting, that nothing was permanent. But what he had built in these walls, what he had crafted from years of hard work, sacrifice, and quiet determination, was something deeper, something that could never be taken away. As he stood there, he thought of his wife, the woman who had shared in the journey, who had understood the value of time and patience long before he did. She would have been proud of the way things had turned out, proud of how he had held steady and true, even in the face of their family's destruction. He could almost hear her voice, soft and steady, patience, always patience. The father smiled softly, a sadness in his eyes, but also a sense of peace. He had done what needed to be done. His children, for all their faults, would have to learn their own way now. He could no longer protect them from their mistakes, nor could he carry the weight of their brokenness. The time for that was over. Daniel, too, found himself in the aftermath, walking the same path of reflection that his father had once walked. The weight of his choices, the silence he had chosen for so long, still pressed on him. He had stood by, allowing his family to destroy itself, but now, as the dust began to settle, he found himself questioning everything. Sitting alone in the old study, he ran his fingers over the worn leather of the journal his father had kept all those years. It had been there in that very room that the secrets had been laid bare, his father's quiet strength, his wife's steady resolve, and the painful unraveling of the family he had once known. But it was also here in this space that Daniel understood the depth of what had been lost. His father had done what no one else could do. He had faced the truth of their situation, had watched them destroy each other, and had allowed time to reveal what was hidden in plain sight. Daniel couldn't help but admire that quiet strength, that unshakable resolve. It was a lesson he had never truly understood until now, but it was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. For the first time, he looked at his own reflection, not with shame or regret, but with the possibility of something new. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape his future. And as he closed his father's journal, he realized that perhaps, in some small way, the legacy his father had left behind was now his to carry. He could rebuild not just the family, but himself. Melissa, unlike Daniel, had not yet found peace. Her mind churned with the ashes of what had been a future she thought was hers to control, a destiny that had slipped through her fingers. She had always prided herself on being the one in control, the one who could bend others to her will, but now, in the quiet aftermath of it all, she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. The legal documents, the irrevocable trust, the foundation, all of it had been a blow she never saw coming. She had underestimated her father's strength, his quiet power. She had underestimated the one thing that had remained constant in his life: patience. While she had fought, while she had screamed and manipulated, he had simply waited. And in the end, his waiting had paid off. But what of her? What of the woman who had tried to destroy her father for the sake of power? What did she have left now? The question haunted her as she sat alone in the empty room, her anger and frustration replaced with something else, a creeping emptiness, a realization that her own actions had led her here. She had no answers, only questions. Was it too late for redemption? Was it possible to rebuild what had been so thoroughly broken? And if so, how? The silence was deafening, louder than any argument, than any betrayal. And for the first time in her life, Melissa found herself at a loss for words. She had no power now, no control. All that was left was the truth, and the truth was far colder than any anger she had ever known. As the days passed, the house settled into a quiet routine. There was no great reconciliation, no final embrace of forgiveness. The family had moved past that, each one of them retreating into their own lives, their own paths. But the silence that had once been oppressive, that had once carried the weight of all their unresolved pain, was now a little lighter. It was no longer filled with bitterness, but with something else, something unspoken. Daniel had found his way back to the small town he had once left behind, where he began working with the charitable foundation his father had established. He didn't need to be a part of the family's destruction anymore. He was ready to rebuild, even if it meant doing so alone. Melissa, too, had begun to withdraw, though not in the way her father or brother had. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew it would not be defined by the house, the money, or the broken relationships. For the first time, she faced the fact that perhaps it was time to let go, to stop trying to control things that were beyond her. As for the father, he continued to live in the house that had once been the center of so much turmoil, but now it was his sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection and peace. Time, as it always had brought him to this point, and as he sat on the porch, the same porch where so many battles had been fought, he knew that this too was part of the journey, the final step in a long and difficult road. He had watched his family unravel. He had seen their darkness, their betrayals, and their mistakes, but in the end he had stood firm, and that, he realized, was all he could ever do. The house was still his. His legacy was still intact. And as the sun set on another quiet evening, he knew that the story of his family and of himself had come full circle. Thank you for taking the time to journey through this story with me. Your attention and engagement mean a lot. I hope you found the narrative impactful and thought-provoking. Stay tuned for more stories to come, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.